Okay, I see more people continuing to join, but let's start. So welcome, everybody. I'm Harjeet Singh, Head of Global Political Strategy at Climate Action Network International. I'm based in New Delhi, India. Such an honor and pleasure to host this session with an esteemed panel, which I'll introduce in a minute. Let me start with some logistics. As you know, it's a 90-minute webinar, and we will hear from panelists on the IPCC AR6 report findings. And then we are hoping to have at least 40-minute long discussion where we'll hear from you, and you can put your questions in the Q&A section. And I hope you're also able to access chat function. So ideally use the Q&A section, but if it is not possible for you for technical reasons, you can also use chat. My colleagues at CAN will extract those questions and then we will respond. It'll be helpful if you don't put those questions anonymously. Put your name. That will be very helpful for us to know and we can respond. So that's a request. Let me now introduce the panel. We have Dr. Simpson, Lead Author, IPCC AR6 Working Group 2 report, which is on climate impacts and adaptation, and he's also author of the AR6 synthesis report that has just been released. He's also Senior Advisor at the Global Center for Climate Mobility and Lead for Knowledge and Practice of the Africa Climate Mobility Initiative. And he's also Honorary Research Associate at the African Climate and Development Initiative at the University of Cape Town. And of course, we'll get a chance to talk a lot more about his expertise in the field of mobility, which is so important. We also have a pleasure of having Dr. Meenal Pathak. She's co-author IPCC AR6 synthesis report and Working Group 3 report, which is on mitigation. And she's also associate professor at the Ahmedabad University. And she has been so actively involved in the process. And we were together in Interlaken, and I could see, and I have so much of respect for IPCC authors. Oh my God, huge amount of work they have done and sleepless nights in Interlaken while this report was being finalized. And I must say a little bit about the report. But before that, let me also introduce our colleagues. So Dr. Stephan Singh, he's the Senior Advisor, Climate Science and Global Energy Policy at Climate Action Network. And of course, our Executive Director, Tasneem Essop. So she heads Climate Action Network International. She's also based in Cape Town. So a bit about the report. I'm sure you know how authoritative this report is and such an important message that it is sending to the world and especially policymakers. It represents the work of thousands of scientists, and hundreds of scientists were involved in synthesizing that and analyzing it. The work started in 2016, and this synthesis report that has come out recently actually connects the dots and builds on 6 reports that have come out in the last few years. And also closes the loop. If you remember, the first report in that series was on 1.5 degree science report in 2018. And this report puts the whole target of 1.5 right at the center. And it tells us in so many ways that the world cannot afford to breach the 1.5 C warming target. It is a survival target. And for policymakers, it should become a linchpin in terms of designing our policies and implementing and really raising ambition. The other thing that is so fascinating to see, the way science has grown in the last few years. This report is not only overarching in terms of the areas that it covers and the perspective it offers, goes beyond climate and connects with social justice, and many other biodiversity crisis that we are facing. So it tells us the direction of travel to the whole world. At the same time, it also offers solutions, some very specific aspects that are important for policymakers. So that's why when this report also comes up with a summary for policymakers, they know what they have to do. So this report, again, delivers a stark warning. We know that we are already facing such impacts at 1.2 degree of temperature rise. But this warning is for policymakers. and telling them that they have a narrow window of opportunity to avert catastrophic climate change. And also telling them that we are at a crossroads. What we do or do not do in the next few years is going to determine our future, not for hundreds, but thousands of years. And this is IPCC telling us. So such an authoritative report telling us clearly what needs to happen. So what we are going to do now, I'll invite Dr. Stephan Singh to just provide the overall context from CAN's perspective very briefly before I go to our other panelists. So over to you, Stephan. Stephan, you are muted.
Okay, thank you. These glitches happen. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everyone, wherever you are. What I will be doing shortly into slides and observations on the IPCC, how we believe what is relevant. There are many things who are relevant. I just picked a couple of issues, and there might not be, and they are certainly not complete. There are many other issues because it is a very, very broad array of issues the IPCC has covered. I think I need to say that we as CAN have been working closely with the IPCC over the last years, if not decades. I think we had lots of sympathy for many things the IPCC were doing. It does not disclose. I'm not disguising that certain issues we had different opinions, but it is normal for an advocacy activist organization. But nevertheless, overall, the gist is that we share many conclusions of the IPCC. And we have to thank the IPCC for doing excellent work since many years. We shouldn't forget that all the authors are doing work free of charge. They're not paid for it. They have jobs in universities, they have jobs in governments, jobs in institutions, but the IPCC work they do literally between midnight and 3 o'clock in the morning. Hard work. So we really have a high esteem for that one. Thank you very much on all the authors and all those who have worked on these reports. First slide, please. How we would put this together is that the multidisciplinary, and it is multidisciplinary, it's not only physical science or engineering science, it's sociologists, it's economists, it's anthroposophicists, it's people, social science, etc. So this multidisciplinary IPCC effort has concluded unequivocally. Staying below 1.5C as a century objective is necessary, doable, cheap, and has many co-benefits beyond climate. In that context, let me say that I have not come across, and I don't think any of my colleagues has, that we had seen over the last year anywhere in any kind of IPCC discussions that the objective of the survival target 1.5C was questioned. We saw overall that all authors were trying to meet with their proposals, with their analyses, with their ideas, this objective in the best way. No need to say that the window of meeting 1.5C is getting narrower and narrower. This is not the problem of the science, that's a problem of the lack of implementation. We also have seen that we have a couple of scientists, academics, and others who outside the IPCC process have been starting to question 1.5C in one way or the other. It's economically not feasible. It's too much a crash course for the economy. We have not seen this argument within the IPCC once. We haven't seen it in Interlaken. If you remember, we have not seen this debate. And this is very promising. That the majority, I would say the science has agreed we can do it. Yes, it's challenging. It becomes challenging every minute, but it's doable. And I think that's the very important message for this survival target. And they also come across, without saying that one this way, as we would say it, we believe that 1.5C is a death penalty for fossil fuels eventually, as the main culprit of climate change, as again and again identified by the IPCC. Accepting the IPCC science also requires massive efforts in adaptation, resilience building, and addressing loss and damage. And not only for trajectories which miss the 1.5C target, also for the 1.5C target. We see it already. We are currently at about 1.1 degrees Celsius global warming. If we want to stay below 1.5C, we still see some additional global warming coming in the next decades. And that, of course, requires more work on those issues I mentioned, which are not mitigation, which, of course, is a bedrock. Early, deep, ambitious mitigation is a bedrock. The report actively urges much higher speed and scale of just transitions, adopting the principles of equity, justice, and solidarity, much more than seen today and in the past. 1.5C policies demand policies and intervention on all greenhouse gases, all economic, industrial, and land use sectors globally, while acknowledging that the rich countries, of course, have a much higher responsibility, but we need to address them all, given the growing role of methane, for instance, what we have seen recently. Next one, please. Can I get the next slide? Thank you. However, what we also know from the science, there will likely be temporary overshoot of the temperature in the early 2030s, even under deep decarbonization efforts. That is caused by the atmospheric carbon legacy. 40 years, the world's powerful people, policymakers, industrialists have been sleeping and let the fossil fuel industry basically to keep on polluting the world. CO2 has been enriched and is highest now since probably about 5 to 10 million years. This is a legacy we have. So even if we stop emissions now radically on a low emission scenario, we will see increase of temperature. That's the way it is, just from a natural science. However, even if we see a temporary overshoot, this does not mean we meet the 1.5C or we violate the 1.5C objective. To meet the 1.5C objective requires that by the year 2100, on the average of 20 years, the average temperature is 1.5C. So a temporary overshoot, as probably risky and unavoidable it is not the final verdict. If we keep on reducing significantly our emissions, phasing out fossil fuels, halting deforestation, etc., we can meet this overall 1.5C target still and reduce temporary overshoot later on and meet this target by the end of the century. But we need to keep on reducing emissions significantly, steadily, and continuously. We also need sustainable negative emissions. I think it's a horrible word, but that's the way it is. Like immediate halt of ecosystem and forest destruction, as well as restoration of degraded ecosystems. The other ways of achieving negative emissions, which the IPCC is discussing, we are not very fond of. That includes certain technologies of carbon dioxide removal, like bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, or direct air capture and storage, which have all different social, environmental, food security implications that are probably detrimental. But we need to have an open debate on negative emissions because we need to reduce the carbon legacy eventually. Key for the IPCC and for us is, and they said it very often, every increment of global warming will increase the risk of low probability, high impact events, irreversible natural system changes on biodiversity extinction, on forest fires decline, sea level rise, droughts, and exponential, that's important, exponential, not linear, threat of extreme events like permanent polar ice melting, warm water corals extinction. I think that's very important to keep in mind that irreversible climate change provided ever-growing risks with ever-growing warming. Last point for me is from the IPCC, and this is very accepted and very welcome. It requires unprecedented and transformational changes in economic, social systems, finances, regulation, multilateral relations, cooperations within and among countries, as well as many other stakeholders like cities, business, etc. The currency, however, is political will. Thank you very much. Harjeet, I see you.
Thank you, Stephan. That was very succinct and an overview of what we have seen coming out of the IPCC report. So without much ado, I'm now going to invite Dr. Nick Simpson to talk about the key findings on vulnerability and adaptation, and also messages to policymakers. As you know, he's the lead author, IPCC AR6 Working Group 2 report, and also author of Synthesis report. So over to you, Nick.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I trust you can see my screen okay.
All good.
Thank you. So, yeah, there's been widespread adverse impacts and related losses and damages to nature and people observed from human-caused climate change that is already affecting many weather and climate extremes in every region across the globe. Human-caused climate change is already affecting much of the planet. As you can see from this figure, evidence of observed climate change in extremes such as heat waves, heavy precipitation, droughts, and tropical cyclones, and in particular, their attribution to human influence is strengthened in this recent assessment. It's virtually certain that hot extremes, including heat waves, have become more frequent and more intense across most land regions since 1950, while cold extremes have become less frequent and less severe. Marine heat waves have approximately doubled in frequency since the 1980s. The frequency and intensity of heavy precipitation events have increased since the 1950s over most land areas for which observational data are sufficient for trend analysis. Human-caused climate change has contributed to increases in agricultural and ecological droughts in some regions due to increased land evapotranspiration, and it is likely that the global proportion of major tropical cyclone occurrence, so that's categories 3 to 5, has increased over the last 4 decades. So what is the consequence of all these changes to our climate system? I'm going to focus mainly on panel A of SPM 1 from the synthesis report that details a high-level synthesis of the impacts of climate change on important domains of human systems and natural systems. In the near term, we will continue to see intensification of currently observed adverse impacts for multiple sectors across every region of the world from human-caused climate change. Figure SPM1A shows observed impacts on ecosystems and human systems attributed to climate change at global and regional scales. It's essentially a synthesis of the lost and the damaged from climate impacts. For human systems, panel A here shows for water availability and food production, health and well-being, cities, settlements and infrastructure, biodiversity and ecosystems. Adverse impacts have been observed for multiple sectors across every region of the world, with some mixed or positive impacts in certain sub-regions. It is important to recognize the regional differences of these impacts, which is affected not just by the exposure to climate hazards, but response options in those regions and vulnerability across very different contexts. Approximately half the world's population live in contexts that are highly vulnerable to climate change. Concerning loss and damage, climate change has caused widespread adverse impacts and related losses and damages to nature and people that are unequally distributed across systems, regions, and sectors. Individual livelihoods have been affected through, for example, destruction of homes and infrastructure and loss of property and income, human health and food security, with adverse effects on gender and social equity. Focusing on water and food, increasing weather and climate extreme events have exposed millions of people to acute food insecurity and reduced water security, with the largest adverse impacts observed in many locations and/or communities across Africa, Asia, Central and South America, LDCs, small islands, and the Arctic, and globally for indigenous peoples, small-scale food producers, and low-income households. Between 2010 and 2020, human mortality from floods, droughts, and storms was 15 times higher in highly vulnerable regions compared to regions with low vulnerability. Roughly half the world's population currently experience severe water scarcity for at least part of the year due to a combination of climatic and non-climatic drivers. In all regions, increases in heat events have resulted in human mortality and morbidity. The occurrence of climate-related foodborne and waterborne diseases and the incidence of vector-borne diseases have increased. In assessed regions, some mental health challenges are associated with increasing temperatures, trauma from extreme events, and loss of livelihood and culture. These impacts on mental health and heritage are two of the many new domains of observed climate impacts in AR6. Concerning migration and displacement of human populations, globally and in almost every region of the world, through displacement and involuntary migration from extreme weather and climate events, climate change has generated and perpetuated vulnerability. Climate and weather extremes are increasingly driving displacement in Africa, Asia, North America, Central and South America, with small island states and in the Caribbean and South Pacific being disproportionately affected. The relationship between climate change and migration is complex, but we are now much more certain that climate is playing a key role in altering patterns of human mobility. But this report highlights that migration does not necessarily mean people move out of risk when they move. In fact, often people are stuck in place, or they may be subjected to new risks. Climate mobility can also exacerbate gendered vulnerabilities and work burdens. And these examples highlight the importance of understanding how responses to climate change affect overall climate impacts. And I'll speak more to that in the next slide. Concerning cities and infrastructure, in urban areas, observed climate change has caused adverse impacts on human health, livelihoods, and key infrastructure. Hot extremes have intensified in cities. Observed adverse impacts are concentrated amongst economically and socially marginalized urban residents. Economic damages from climate change have been detected in climate-exposed sectors such as agriculture, forestry, fishery, energy, and tourism. Individual livelihoods have been affected. Digging down into the underlying chapters, this is well illustrated in Chapter 9 of Working Group 2 that assesses climate change has reduced the economic growth across Africa, citing an example that between 1991 and 2010, Africa was on average 13.6% lower GDP growth than if climate change had not occurred. Concerning biodiversity and ecosystems, climate change has caused substantial damages and increasingly irreversible losses in terrestrial, freshwater, cryospheric, and coastal and open ocean ecosystems. Hundreds of local losses of species have been driven by increases in the magnitude of heat extremes, with mass mortality events recorded on land and in the ocean. All global model pathways that limit global warming to 1.5 with no or limited overshoot, and those that limit warming to 2 degrees Celsius involve rapid and deep, and in many cases, immediate greenhouse gas emission reductions in all sectors this decade. Concerning impacts, however, despite progress, adaptation gaps exist between current levels of adaptation and levels needed to respond to the impacts and reduce climate risks. At the time of the present assessment, there are gaps between global ambitions and what we need to get done. In the next slide, I'm going to speak to panel C of SPM 1. Sorry, this is from the long report. So risks arise from not just hazards, exposure, and vulnerability, but also from the 6th assessment report, from responses to climate change that fail to achieve their ends. This includes risks from maladaptation and adverse side effects of some emissions reduction and carbon dioxide removal measures, such as afforestation of naturally unforested land or poorly implemented bioenergy, compounding climate-related risks to biodiversity, food and water security, and livelihoods. It is important, therefore, to recognize in the context of climate change, responses, impacts can result from adaptation or mitigation responses, not achieving the intended objectives, or just being ignored or delayed. Climate change is a threat to human well-being and planetary health. Evidence of observed impacts, projected risks, levels and trends of vulnerability and adaptation limits demonstrate that worldwide climate resilient development action is urgent. But what we see is with further warming, climate change risks will become increasingly complex and more difficult to manage. Multiple climate and non-climatic risk drivers will interact, resulting in compounding overall risks and impacts, including risk cascades across sectors and regions. For example, climate-driven food insecurity and supply instability are projected to increase with increasing global warming, interacting with non-climatic risk drivers, such as competition for land between urban expansion and food production, or pandemics and conflict. With further warming, sorry, I'll jump onto an example now. I've got a sea level rise example that shows these cascading impacts and risk. Sea level rise is unavoidable for centuries to millennia due to continuing deep ocean warming and ice sheet melt, and sea levels will remain elevated for thousands of years. Global mean sea level increase by 0.2 meters between 1901 and 2018 has been observed, and global mean sea level rise will continue in the 21st century. This is virtually certain, with projected regional relative sea level rise within 20% of the global mean. Due to relative sea level rise, extreme sea level events that occurred once per century in the recent past are projected to occur at least annually at more than half of all tidal gauge locations by 2100. And risks for coastal ecosystems, people, and infrastructure will continue to increase beyond 2100. At sustained warming levels between 2 and 3 degrees, the Greenland and West Antarctic ice sheets will be lost almost completely and irreversibly over multiple millennia. Importantly, as noted before, the probability of low likelihood outcomes associated with potentially very large impacts increases with higher global warming levels. Climate hazards can initiate impact cascades that affect multiple sectors and propagate across regions, following complex natural and societal connections. Concurrent and cascading risks from climate change to food systems, human settlements, infrastructure, and health will make these risks more severe and more difficult to manage, including when interacting with non-climatic risk drivers. Increasing transboundary risks are projected across food, energy, water sectors as impacts from weather and climate extremes propagate through supply chains, markets, and natural resource flows. This example of a compound heat wave and a drought event striking an agricultural region shows how multiple risks are interconnected and lead to cascading biophysical, economic, societal impacts, even in distant regions, with vulnerable groups such as smallholder farmers, children, and pregnant women particularly impacted. For any given warming level, the severity of future impacts will also depend on trends in vulnerability and exposure of humans and ecosystems and their ability to respond. Future exposure of climate hazards is increasing globally due to socioeconomic development. But human vulnerability will concentrate, for example, in human informal settlements and rapidly growing smaller settlements and in rural areas. Thank you. I think I'll stop there because I've gone a minute over my time, but happy to take any questions in the Q&A answer session. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Nick. That was super sharp and clear, and a very loud message to everybody that we know all the risks, and now it's all about our response, and we know what kind of cascading risks that we are facing, the connections and interconnections in particular that you highlighted, and also telling us that every fraction of warming will have devastating consequences. So our action and inaction and even wrong actions, what you said about maladaptation really matter, and that connects very well to the next presentation that Meenal is going to make on the importance of mitigation. But before going to Meenal, I would like to thank participants for their questions and also remind that apart from Q&A section, if you want to put your question in the chat, you are welcome. And we will come back to your questions after Meenal's presentation. So Dr. Meenal Pathak, she's again, to remind you, she's the co-author of IPCC AR6 synthesis report and Working Group 3 report on mitigation. So over to you, Meenal.
Thank you so much, Harjeet, and thanks everyone for joining at wherever you are and whatever time zones you are in. Just can you please confirm if you can see my slides?
Yes.
Yeah, I just need to go to the screen share. Just give me a minute.
And I must mention in using that time that we have about 80 participants and we are seeing some real active interaction. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining again. Over to you, Meenal.
Thank you so much,
we can see
Harjeet.
the full screen.
Thank you so much, and thanks for inviting me to this webinar. So very quickly, for those who just joined, as Stephan said, that this report synthesizes the 6 key reports of this cycle of the IPCC since 2018. So the 3 main reports on physical climate science, impact, adaptation, and vulnerability, and Working Group 3, which is mitigation of climate change, which I will speak to. And then the 3 special reports on oceans, land, and 1.5. So this is a meta-level synthesis of several reports. So this includes thousands of studies which were assessed throughout these few years, including maybe hundreds of thousands of comments from governments, from experts, and it's been a long process. So I'm glad we have this opportunity to speak about this report, and hopefully this will provide important inputs to action in the coming years. So also just to add that I'm speaking on behalf of several authors in the synthesis report, including the section facilitators and co-chairs, all of who are not here but have contributed to this report. So not surprisingly that greenhouse gas emissions continue to increase. If you see the 2019 levels in the graph on the side, then you'll see that CO2 emissions from fossil fuel and industry dominate the emissions, and we are seeing no while the growth rates have decreased just a little bit, but these are varied across the world, and overall we are seeing that the current trends are not looking very good if we want to reach where we have to reach. So if you ask us, how do we, what is the synthesis, or what are the three key messages or that I would like to mention here? And I'd like to first highlight, of course, the emission gap, that the country's nationally determined contributions are not ambitious enough. At the current level, or at the current policies, the way they are announced, we might reach between 2.2 and 3.5 degrees temperature increase. So clearly the ambition is not enough, but also in terms of implementation, there is a gap, that the policies that are implemented are not on track to deliver their commitments. So this is a significant gap. The second one, as Nick very well highlighted, is the adaptation gap, that looking at the current and future climate, there is a huge gap, and this varies across regions. So some regions are really not equipped to deal with the changing climate. And also to highlight that adaptation options lose effectiveness with increased warming, and about 2 degrees, several of these options become unavailable for some regions, and that's an alarming finding. And finally, maybe Harjeet and Can colleagues also speak about this, the financing gap that we really need. One is we need to increase the pie, of course, to increase the share of resources, the finance that goes to climate action, but also direct it and address the barriers that prevent accessing finance to the relevant regions, sectors, and countries. So, well, the challenge is, of course, we know that we need deep, rapid, and sustained emission reductions across all sectors in this decade. As Stephan also mentioned, that our remaining carbon budget, as assessed in the report, was 500 gigatons, and every minute as we speak, and every year and every month, we continue to lose that carbon budget, and it keeps shrinking. So we don't have, for example, the remaining carbon budget is not enough to take us through this decade, and for 2 degrees also it's largely depleted. So there is an urgency that the report strongly speaks to. And clearly fossil fuel industry and infrastructure cannot continue the way it is or as originally planned. So if we look at the current fossil fuel infrastructure, it's already consuming a huge share of the carbon budget. And if you look at the planned infrastructure, then that almost exceeds the budget we have. Therefore, we cannot continue the way we have to. The figure on the left, and I will probably not go into too much detail here, but shows the sectoral mitigation here. So you can see that all the sectors rapidly going down if you see the lines from 2020 onwards. So the report shows that we need to mitigate, or we needed to peak before 2025, peak global emissions before 2025 to reach pathways that limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And some sectors in the model pathways go down faster than the other sectors. But clearly now it's not the time to pick and choose. We have to act across sectors and across regions. The report has a strong focus on equity. So the figure on the left shows the cumulative, so the total amount to date emissions, CO2 emissions per region. And the period that we show this is for 1850 to 2019. And the figure on the right shows the per capita emissions per region. So if you look at the figure on the left, you can see that some regions, for example, South Asia, for example, Africa, have had a very small share of the total anthropogenic CO2 emissions till date. And if you look at the current emissions, greenhouse gas emissions per region, then also you can see that there are regions with very high population, but their per capita emissions are very low, like between 2 and 3, whereas per capita emissions, for example, for many of the developed countries are close to 20. So it's significant, almost an order of magnitude. So there is a huge disparity in the availability of resources, of endowment, and therefore of emissions between countries and regions. Well, I think we've had enough of depressing messages so far, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the hope that the report gives. And well, the good news is that if we act now, then we reduce costs in the long term. We avoid lock-in of infrastructure and avoid stranding of assets, stranding of, for example, fossil fuel assets. And when we say lock-in, it means, like, for example, if you construct more roads in cities, we are committing to drive, we are committing to a car-based urban system. And if we want to avoid that, then investment or action now would save us those costs. The good news the report clearly spells out is that climate action provides co-benefits. And just to give you an example, providing clean access in many regions which do not have currently access to affordable and clean energy can deliver multiple benefits, economic benefits, jobs, employment, even deliver gender goals. And we list some of these climate actions. The clear one is, of course, air pollution reduction that delivers health benefits. And the great news that I would like to share, and I think I sound more hopeful than I am probably, but the report does show evidence that multiple feasible and effective options are available, both to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to adapt to climate change. I will quickly run you through this figure, but I noticed earlier that one of the authors from the report who's contributed to the figure, Leila, is also here. So maybe Leila, if you wanted to come in during the Q&A, I'm happy to have you also speak to some of this. But this is really our attempt to synthesize both adaptation and mitigation. So the left panel, as you see here, is adaptation, climate response and adaptation options. And if you look on the right, it's the mitigation options. So for the adaptation options, we look at how feasible these are, and then whether these options have synergies with mitigation. And on the right, you can see the potential of these options to deliver emission reduction. And the figure at the bottom shows the demand side. So when people change their demand or change lifestyles across all these sectors, what is the emission reduction possible? So you can see that we looked at 6 systems. So energy supply, land, water, and food, settlements and infrastructure, health, society, livelihoods and economy, and industry and waste. So there's a range of options across each of these sectors that can deliver both adaptation and mitigation. So I will go through some of these options, but probably we don't have time to go through all of them. But these options are available now. So the science is clear that there is evidence that many of these options are tried and tested. They work in many regions. Of course, we need to design these for diverse contexts, and not every option works everywhere. But the big message, as the last bullet point on the slide says, is that these need to be scaled up and applied more widely. So we can no longer afford to celebrate pilots, so to say. We have to go beyond incremental action. So I will zoom in on 2 of these panels. This one, the top panel, shows the mitigation options in the energy sector, and the bottom one shows the options in the agriculture, forestry, and land use sector. And the length of the bar shows how much reduction is possible at a particular cost. And the cost ranges go from blue to red, as in low cost to high cost. So you can see that solar and wind, a huge potential is available at not a very high cost compared to, for example, fossil CCS, and compared to some other options such as bioenergy CCS, which can deliver an option, but currently the costs of mitigation are quite high. The report calls out to action and ecosystems. Again, Stephan and both Harjeet stressed upon biodiversity and ecosystems, but if you protect and conserve existing ecosystems and restore these ecosystems, if you invest in reforestation and afforestation, then this can deliver emission reduction, but also some of these deliver a range of benefits, especially biodiversity. So aligning with other biodiversity goals, like protecting 30 to 50% of the land and oceans area would deliver mitigation as well as development. I also would like to focus on the dietary shift that is highlighted here, that this comes mainly from the land report, but also from the mitigation report, that shifting to plant-based diets, to locally produced foods, to nuts and legumes instead of meat can actually reduce substantial emissions from the food systems. And about 1/3 of the food is lost or wasted in many regions of the world. And this is a significant option to reduce emissions as well. This one shows the actions in settlements, transport, and industry. So you can see on the top is actions for buildings and transport and cities. And we see that efficient buildings, for example, deliver substantial mitigation in the building sector. But so many of these transport options, look at this, fuel efficient vehicles, efficient appliances in buildings, shifting to public transport and bicycling. These are not high cost options. They are the lowest cost in the assessed figure. Of course, for shipping and aviation, we don't have great technology options, but then efficiency is an important mitigation option for shipping and aviation. And the one I'd like to highlight here is the avoid option for demand for energy services. So reducing the floor area for housing, for example, or just not driving. Some of these options can have a potential for reducing emissions. In the industry sector, fuels, which has the highest mitigation potential, but there's energy efficiency, you can see, which is at a relatively lower cost material efficiency compared to, for example, CCS and some of the other options, which would be expensive to scale up, I think. So we highlighted equity in the beginning, but the report clearly states, and Nick also mentioned this, that we've been through decades of unsustainable consumption. Several regions of the world still don't have access to energy. And at the same time, individuals with high socioeconomic status and incomes, they consume a lot more. And because of that, they also have a high potential for emission reduction. And we call out to status consumption and reducing status consumption. It also applies to countries at the international level, where we talk about how countries come from different starting points, and not every country has the same capacity to act on mitigation and adaptation. And therefore, all countries need to show ambition in addressing climate change, but high emitting and wealthier countries and people have a particular responsibility to deliver their fair share of commitments. I would also like to highlight point number 2 on my slide, which shows that ambitious pathways will lead to sometimes disruptive changes, including changing or loss of jobs, changes in economic structure. And these would have distributional consequences across countries, but also within countries of communities which work in particular sectors, and they are more vulnerable to some of these. So we need to understand some of these trade-offs. But the report shows that climate mitigation actions have a lot of synergies with sustainable development goals. And some of these trade-offs can be managed through appropriate policies and understanding. And I know the CAN has just transition experts in this panel, so I'll be happy to discuss this in detail later. This is, I think, one of my last slides, maybe. So, well, no surprises here that the current flows of finance are inadequate. They are not reaching all the regions, all the countries, and the people who need it the most. A lot of finance is directed to mitigation, but not enough to adaptation. And several developing countries need external funding to meet their adaptation needs. There are options available to scale up financing, but then again, there is a significant role of different actors in meeting these financing ambitions. And we are falling quite short of the $100 billion goal that we had agreed to in Paris and by UNFCCC. So I will not discuss this complicated but beautiful figure in detail. We worked very hard on it, and Nick has also been one of the contributors. But this one shows where we are. So this is the starting point where we are, and we have a choice now. We have choices to go along the like so-called better pathways with lower emissions and more equity and lower climate risk compared to going down, where we get entrenched in higher emissions and maladaptation, and where we reach adaptation limits. So these are choices that we can make now towards for emission reductions, for adaptation, and that also deliver development outputs. On the left of this figure, you can see the conditions that enable and conditions that constrain these actions. And you can see that governance, technology, and finance, and several of these actions can enable shift to sustainable development pathways. And there are synergies between climate and development actions. And I'd like to highlight that behavior and lifestyle changes can, if they are supported by policies, by infrastructure, and by technologies, can help end users shift to low emission intensive consumption. So I will conclude with this line from the synthesis report presentation, that the choices and actions implemented in this decade or now will have impacts both now and for thousands of years. So thank you, and over to you, Harjeet. I hope I met the time.
Very well. Thank you so much, Meenal. Again, very sharp presentation. And of course, starting with telling us such an alarming situation that we are facing right now, and how current policies are taking us beyond 3 degrees of warming, which is going to be so devastating for us. But at the same time, ending with the hope message. And despite knowing that a lot is driven by policies and politics, and how we do still see that policy paralysis and delaying and even deception in the form of false solutions. And what we need is political will. And thank you also for highlighting the issue of finance, which we will definitely pick up in the conversation. But I think the important point that you made about choices, and I'll again repeat that phrase: we are at a crossroads. It is for us now to make those choices. I would like you to stay on, Meenal, and I have a follow-up question, especially on the point that you made on demand side and supply side. This report really balances that. On one hand, it really raises the issue of fossil fuels, how more investments are going in fossil fuels, and issues related to subsidies. So instead of providing finance for positive solutions and reducing emissions and adaptation, more money is going to the fossil fuel industry. But at the same time, it also talks about the demand side, which you outlined, in a few sectors, and particularly lifestyle changes. You coming from India, I would also like you to share challenges that you see in emerging economies like India to move away from fossil fuels and adopt a greener development. If you can unpack that a little bit, and then I'll invite Nick to also add. Nick is from South Africa. So yeah, it would be good to hear from you the challenges, and then I'll take up questions that are coming from the floor. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Harjeet. I will answer the question on challenges, but it is challenging to answer that. It's never easy to move away from systems that we are locked into. We are essentially in India a fossil fuel based system. A lot of our energy, especially electricity, comes from coal. But that is not to say that it is, like, I would use Stephan's word. I think he said challenging but doable. But I will sort of edit that and say challenging but not impossible. There are areas of action. Again, that depends on finance. In many cases, it depends on the availability of technologies, but we have to stop fossil fuel subsidies. There's no way we can continue going along that. But then all these ambitious and bold steps also have challenges. And I would like to highlight one of these, given the time, that if you talk about moving away from coal, for example, in India, so many districts depend on coal. So there are jobs, and these are also the poorest districts in the country. And so there'll be hundreds of thousands of people who might be affected. But then again, this transition is going to happen. So we really need to start working on preparing ourselves for the transition. Which are those districts? Where are the jobs? What is the socioeconomic conditions of the people? How do we better prepare them for this transition? And finally, I would also like to say that it's also about political will. Whether we like it or not, there has to be a strong political will to effect that change. And I would like to use this platform to say that it is really a direct direction that the government has to give, of wanting to undertake ambitious change. And then all stakeholders, of course, need to act together. So the private sector and all, but really I think the political will is the strongest element of this change.
Thank you, Meenal. And Nick, you may like to bring in your perspective, and particularly the challenges in South Africa.
Yeah, the challenges in South Africa are particularly severe, partly due to the historical legacy, the infrastructure lock-in that the country is built on, and the political alignment with progress even since the fall of apartheid to embrace a fossil fuel energy source. However, South Africa is also incredibly resource endowed with wind and solar energy resources, and strategic environmental assessments have been conducted to encourage zones of investment in those areas. Importantly though, and this is a finding coming out of the synthesis report, particularly in emerging economies, public sector finance is needed to drive initial investment and encourage private sector investment in renewable energy development and their integration into a public energy mix. For that to happen, however, there is a significant need of political will to transition in that way, and a recognition of the winners and the losers out of that transition. And in South African context, many of the people that are currently living in very exposed areas that are, we have over 20,000 people that die every year because of poor air quality, because they live near coal-fired power stations, but whose livelihoods are dependent on the coal energy system, either on extraction or transportation of that energy. And so there needs to be a careful and just transition for those communities, including education, capacity development, skills development, for them to find new skills and transition into a lower carbon future. Least they get left behind, and those marginalized communities that are already dependent on coal, their vulnerability might increase if it's not carefully transitioned through. And I would also add to that, that across Africa, not just in South Africa, although perception of climatic changes is generally high due to continental social opinion surveys, understanding of human-caused climate change and its immediate and future risks to their livelihood is very low, particularly in rural areas. And so in order to facilitate that transition, we need to boost climate change literacy to help people understand that the livelihood that they're in now is a risk to their own lives and to their children's futures.
Thank you so much, Nick. I think the message is absolutely clear. Is all about, and what you and Meenal said, it's about planning. It's about knowing the risks. Science is making it clearer and clearer with every report and analysis that we know the direction of travel. We need to now plan things. We can't just leave it to chances and allow things to happen on their own. And especially the role of governments is absolutely clear. So there are a number of questions. I'm going to pick up those from the floor. There's a very specific question for the scientist, and let me read it for you. It's the question is, what should or can other scientists around the world do to advocate for transformational change, work within existing systems, or take to the streets? Meenal responded in the chat. So Nick, if I can ask you to share, and Meenal, please feel free to come in to add what you said in that Q&A section. So yeah, what should scientists do? And please go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, a great question. And I think, firstly, when it comes to climate action, there's no dichotomies that we should put out there. There's no either or, do this or that. Climate change is everything change. And our response needs to be across the whole of society, deep within research, finding new research themes for scientists, but also engaging deeply in community. But I think a really interesting thing in that question is the word transformational change. And what we see in the 6th assessment report is, particularly on the adaptation side, most climate change adaptation that has been observed since 2014 is incremental, behavioral, and household level. So small and unlikely, with limited evidence of effectiveness at future levels of global warming. So we need to move beyond incremental changes, slow and household changes, to much more rapid, scalable, and transformational changes. But I think critically, it's also important that the responsibility for those changes is clearly understood at multiple levels. Okay, we can't interpret the response to climate change to be a shedding of the responsibility for climate change on vulnerable people. for example, and those that have contributed least to the problem. That transformational change has to be systemic change. It has to be high-level policy changes as well as household-level changes. And I've got a personal bugbear against the narrative that is peddled by fossil fuel companies that individual personal lifestyle change is going to get us out of climate change. It's not. We need fundamental changes to our economies, our modes of production, our politics. And so my last point on that would be, if you're a scientist and you're a social scientist or a political scientist or an economist, the climate research space is open for you for the next 10 years because we got the physical stuff in place. What we don't have is the leverage points in social, political domains to really change society. Yeah.
Very, very well said, Nick, and especially highlighting the role of governments. You can't just dump the responsibilities onto the individuals and citizens. Meenal, anything to add, and also especially the role of scientists?
Yeah, I get asked this question a lot. And as a scientist, it's difficult, right? Am I doing enough? Like, because a lot of friends say, oh, you're a scientist, why is nothing changing? And I'm like, as a scientist, I have done my bit. I have done more than my bit. I have put the strong science out there. And yet probably it's not enough. So as a scientist, we can definitely do more. The IPCC lays out the global menu of options, but then again, there is so much more to be done. And the science in developing countries is still developing. Well, we don't have enough literature on many of these options. So I think we do need to work out context-specific solutions. So there is more science to be done. There's also like a lot of conversation around CCS and CDR, and we have to dispel some of these misconceptions about the scale of some of these options, that it's not going to be so easy to say, okay, we'll fix it in the next decade if we cannot fix it now. And there are always technical solutions available. There aren't. And there was a Nature paper yesterday which talked about that humanity has solved the ozone layer problem and some of the others, and we'll solve this one. Well, in the past, we have only managed to stop the sources. So in this case, also, if we were to follow the past example, we have to stop releasing fossil fuels. That is the real solution. But I also like the question that take to the streets, and increasingly many of us as scientists also feel responsible to say that we have to be bold enough to say that this should be done or this should not be done. And therefore some amount of activism is okay, necessary, and I suppose justified. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Meenal. And I must also recognize this question came from Susie Arnott, and really a very important question for us. And thank you for your inputs. There's also a question which is about what, of course, thanking the work of scientists, but also what could not make to the report. If you can also highlight that, and also for others to know that the summary for policymakers is a negotiated document. There's, the underlying reports and the working group reports are so rich. So if there's anything that you would like to highlight, or you wanted to see it coming out much more strongly, because of course it's a summary, you can't have everything in the same detail. So anything, Meenal or Nick, you would like to highlight, which you wanted to see more strongly coming out?
I would have liked to see sustainable development aspects coming in more strongly in the mitigation parts of the report. It's there in the vulnerability sections, but I think the question is also phrased around what we lost during approval. So I'd like to clarify that the final word does still reside with the scientists. So governments can object, they can propose changes, but the authors get a final say in what sentence goes on the screen. And therefore, if you look at the draft version that we submitted and what was finally approved, there isn't a very big difference. So we didn't sort of lose that much. But from Working Group 3, there was a finance figure that couldn't make it into the summary, but that made it into the synthesis report. So there's also balance of space, of countries' priorities, but finally strong science does prevail. So yeah, short answer maybe.
Thank you. And it's important to clarify. Nick?
Yeah, so I think I'd also like to clarify a little bit that from my experience on a few approval sessions, although it's gossip worthy to try and, figure out who was who in the approval session, trying to shoot down a text. It's very important that the public realizes that actually 99% of the governments that are involved in this process are there negotiating in good faith and pressing for stronger ambition. And that definitely on the synthesis report, the majority of input that came from a diversity of countries wanted stronger ambition and wanted accuracy. So all of the questions coming were, does this sentence line up with this paragraph in the underlying report? And that was the engagement over that. From my perspective, I would love to have seen some of the more regional detail percolate higher into the SPM of the synthesis report. But got to also understand that there's a significant word limit to every summary for policymakers. And that means that some of the really rich detail that's on South Asia, that's on parts of West Africa, that's on parts of the Andes in the mountains chapter of Working Group 2, doesn't come through well in a summary for policymakers. All of that detail is in the underlying chapters. And so I really encourage anybody, if you want to go read the science of the IPCC, read the underlying chapters of each report. If you want to understand the policymaker articulation of that science, read the SPM.
Thank you. And yeah, it's important to clarify that because we know it's a political process, but scientists have the last word. And we were very thrilled to see some of us who were in Interlaken. And I would like to bring in Stephan, who has been following this issue for, I would say for decades, Stephan, right? So, and you have seen that progression. Give a civil society perspective on this one. How do we look at it?
Yeah, thank you, Harjeet, and thank you for the colloquial and very important contributions by Nick and Meenal. I think it's very important. Well, let me start with which did not go in, which we supported. I think that's also a positive view. Issues we didn't want to have in. First thing is solar radiation management, which is becoming a new hype recently in some areas of the world. There are increasingly many webinars coming up and meetings coming up. And the IPCC had a couple of times said very clearly, the risks of solar radiation management are probably uncontrollable, not a mitigation option. And it wasn't even mentioned in the summary for policymakers. That's a good message. Second thing, nuclear. One of the biggest fault solutions we are saying with lots of implications on other things, on nuclear waste, etc., wasn't even mentioned in the entire report, nor in the SPM, apart from the slide, Meenal, you showed thankfully on the costs. And then you saw that compared to solar and wind, nuclear is a non-option. Certainly offsets, an issue which is driving by the fossil fuel companies. Well, we can keep on using fossil fuels, and then we plant trees, we protect the forest somewhere else, on land, which we do not own, with people, which are not our stuff, but somehow we manage that one. Not mentioned, it's not in there. And knowing that the IPCC is not policy prescriptive, they cannot say we don't want that, or we want that. They can only describe. And how I read between the lines, and when I've talked to authors, is not mentioning things means basically out of discussion for us, right? That's an interpretation we have to take. However, I'm not going to be naive here. The issues here we have tried to get in, which I think are important from a atmospheric and significant transparency context, is military emissions are not considered. There are political reasons for that one that came from Kyoto Protocol, where the US opposed that one because it would represent some kind of force majeure reduction, and this should be outside. And then many other countries, and you know the usual suspects, they nodded and agreed with the US. So it's out since then. But the atmosphere sees those emissions, and those emissions might be between 1 and 2 gigatons CO2 per year, might be. We don't have inventories for that one. Second, in the land use report, initially, there were very good assessments on what is the difference between CO2 emissions from deforestation and land use, not based on the inventories of the governments, but based on the assessments on the ground by scientists and by bookkeeping models. Not in there, because they use the inventories from the governments. 5 gigatons CO2 missing. We see them in the atmosphere, but they're not coming in the overall emissions inventory in the IPCC. I think that's one. And then there's social aspects. I think the IPCC tried to increasingly address issues of safety nets, social security, and social equity. That's very good and very welcome. But I think they sharpened their mouths, but didn't whistle significantly by saying, and you're right, by saying that the rich households of the world, the 10% richest, produce about 45% CO2 emissions, and the poorest 50% only up to 14%. But then nothing comes afterwards. I think we need to go into a strong social system domestically. This is not only equity between countries, but also inside countries. The billionaires of the world have a destructive impact on the atmosphere and on many other things too. This is the money we would need. We need to have, I think personally, a debate on better taxing the super rich, which are also the super polluters. I know the political contentiousness in that one, but I think as scientists, we cannot shy away from that debate in a very proactive manner. Last point on the issue of individual behavior. I like that the IPCC addressed the issue of diets and food waste. I think it's very important because it also saves land, not only emissions, it saves biodiversity. It increases food security, but it creates land for growing more crops, right? So I think I would like to see a little bit more direct saying, not about more plant-based diets, say that the biggest problem is the cow system we have involved in our industrial agriculture. But I think this is the kind of thing, I know many governments don't want this, and I give kudos to the IPCC because you can only take, as scientists, and you don't make the models yourself, you can only take what's out there by the science and by the literature. You cannot develop your own models. I understand this fully. But I think there's a way by all scientists, not just by the IPCC, to address those issues in a proactive way so it gets in the literature, gets peer-reviewed, and plays a role in the consequential IPCC reports. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephan, and yeah, also for highlighting what could have been said stronger, but also there are underlying reports. The message is overall, the headline message in so many ways is loud and clear. But I would like Meenal to say very briefly on this whole issue of consumption and demand, and also respond to a question. Again, I'm going back to the synthesis report and the session that we had in Interlaken. There's a reference to the ENB report about the projections for 2035 and what was the background. Again, not going a lot into politics, but just to clarify that point so that everybody's clear. So Meenal, over to you for those two questions.
Thank you so much. I'll take the 2035 question. I will have to go back to check with the authors again because I was not involved in that figure. But as far as I understand, the model projections on the basis of which these figures were developed talk about decadal numbers, and 2035 falls in the middle. So it would require some adjustment to the numbers. And as scientists, we were not very confident of those numbers when we were extrapolating this. And this is as far as I know, the scientific and technical reason for that. So I can come back maybe individually to clarify further, but that's a confident answer. And on demand, I really appreciate what Stephan said very clearly about these 10% of the households exist in every continent, in every country. And we really need to do something about this status consumption. On one hand, it's also about awareness. So how do you present the menu of options? I can take the public transport to work, but the public transport has to be available. So there's one aspect of awareness. But the second one is really doing something about all the SUVs on the roads and how we fix the transport system. So even in India, I'm like seeing an increasing number of SUVs on the road. I'm seeing people buying more houses, bigger houses. And this is just like a very small part of the country, but we cannot say as a developing country, there's still the rich which consume disproportionately. And it's not just about mitigation, but it's also about resources like water, like energy, like materials. So we really, I think that point does come out strongly in the report, and we would like to emphasize this further. Maybe that is for the next IPCC cycle. Can I just very quickly take the CCS question? And it has been approved, yes, because CCS is one of the options, and IPCC lays down the menu of options, like I said, and IPCC does not say this technology is better compared to the other. We lay down the options, we lay down the costs, we lay down the feasibility, and on CCS we can clearly see that this is relative to other energy options, lower mitigation potential and higher cost, and the existing CCS technology is not viable at the scale at which we need. And so there are several technological, environment, social, and other challenges to upscaling CCS. So I'll stop here and over to you, Harjeet.
Thank you. And I think it's important to continue to recognize the challenges with some of the, which we call as false solutions and even dangerous distractions, because we have all the solutions, particularly the cost, the way it has been mentioned on solar and wind, the potential we have, and so many options that we can take in terms of lifestyle and the role of governments. We don't have to go for these unproven technologies. So there's a question, Nick, if I may come to you. Okay, before that, I should also recognize that the question on what is missing was from Archie Rastogi. I hope you are satisfied with the answer. And that was an anonymous question on 2035. That also reminds me that the debate on 2035 was also long, because we know that also coincides with the next cycle of global stocktake. So as you, Meenal, very rightly said, we were still looking at the number crunching, but from the political perspective, it was important to mention 2035 so that it can help us in the negotiations further when we are going to set the target for the next round of nationally determined contribution. So I think that's where the politics and science interacted a lot, and that's what took more time. Okay, I'll go to you, Nick, to respond to the question around just share a few corrective measures related to sustainable agriculture, what can be done. So you can speak from adaptation and also mitigation perspective as you like. So over to you, Nick.
Yeah, thank you. And nice question, because climate smart agriculture, agroecological practices, and sustainable agricultural intensification are part of a suite of responses to climate change that have really strong adaptation benefits, but co-benefits with mitigation, as well as co-benefits for progress towards sustainable development goals when implemented. And across the Working Group 2 report, particularly in the Africa chapter, but as well as in other chapters, there are multiple adaptation feasibility assessments that look at how effective this approach is at current warming levels. It's unable to project it for future warming levels generally, but also importantly, how feasible is it across different contexts? Because just because an approach is effective in one context, it's not necessarily feasible in other contexts. And so, I would refer you to have a look at the technical summary of Working Group 2, as well as the summary for policymakers. But if you want a regional differentiation of the multi-factor dimensions affecting the feasibility of climate smart agriculture or agroecological processes or water use in agriculture, in improving irrigation practices, etc. The feasibility assessment in the Africa chapter also goes through that, and it looks at the economic, environmental, social, institutional, technological dimensions of feasibility. So where are there barriers of technology, for example, or barriers of finance for a particular sub-region of a continent? And it's really interesting to see that there's a diversity of feasibility depending on context. So it's very feasible when technological, finance, behavioral, and institutional dimensions are in place, and those are the aspects of feasibility that need a targeted investment to facilitate wider and scalable use of climate smart agriculture, for example. But without them, just one dimension, for example, without adequate finance at a local level, at a farm level, the feasibility declines rapidly, independent of climate variables. So these are all social and political and financial dimensions of feasibility to adaptation. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Nick. And again, highlighting the point that we know what's going to work and what the solutions are. I want to bring the issue of loss and damage here. We know, I mean, we call on the politics side loss and damage, and in IPCC and science reports, it's about losses and damages for all the political reasons. We know it has been a contentious issue, but that it is a lived reality now for not just millions, but billions. And the IPCC report says it very clearly, half of the world's population is facing this vulnerability, and particularly in the developing world. And science and all this kind of analysis has really helped advance the issue and understanding, despite the resistance coming from the politics and from rich countries. And of course, the work that civil society has done and the way Climate Action Network made loss and damage an important issue for COP26, COP27, and will continue to work on it. And of course, governments fought for it very strongly last year. And it's not a side issue anymore. And Nick, the way it has been highlighted in the Working Group 2 report and in the synthesis report. In fact, the previous versions had less references to losses and damages than the final versions, and we are very happy to see it's coming out strongly and all the governments supporting. And I would also like to connect that with a meeting that we attended in Luxor, Egypt last week, which is of the first transitional committee meeting, now responding to these challenges by working towards implementing the COP27 decision on operationalizing the loss and damage fund and funding arrangements. So one can clearly see, what comes out of science, and then civil society and politicians push for that, and now we're beginning to see that action, which is really important. So any message that you would like to give, Nick, on how important this issue is, and particularly on the continuum side, and what policymakers need to do? They can't just ignore the issue anymore.
Yeah, big question. For me, this is like the tip of the spear of climate action for the next 5 years. Firstly, the global goal on adaptation, and secondly, its relationship to understanding and getting traction on loss and damage. Why do I say the global goal on adaptation? Because the global goal on adaptation will give us very specific metrics and progress to where the limits of adaptation are being reached. And beyond those limits, we are into the space of loss and damage. And for the audience's sake, within the IPCC, we use the word losses and damages just to differentiate between the parallel process that's going on around capital L, capital D loss and damage, which is a political process exterior to the IPCC assessment. But when you're reading the word losses and damages in the IPCC assessment, you can be thinking this is the same. Yeah, there are lost and damaged dimensions to human and natural systems. And I think from a climate action perspective, it's really important to try and keep a human face on that. Sometimes because the numbers are so big, the rates of change are so scary, and projections difficult to handle, we can lose that human face. And so I think a good way to frame climate action going forward, coming out of all the evidence of impacts, limits to adaptation being already reached in many regions of the world, our progress going forward is really minimizing future loss and damage. It's here already. So our task is to try and offset and minimize what will be lost and what will be damaged in our future from climate change.
Thank you so much, Nick. And I'll take that as your final message for policymakers, where you really bring that continuum of action and human face so strongly. Meenal, if I give you 30 seconds, one quick message for policymakers before I hand it over to Tasneem.
Act now.
That was pretty sharp. Okay. Anything else to add? But yeah.
No, I think yeah, take bolder action and look at transformation rather than incremental change.
Perfect. Tasneem, over to you. Please wrap it up for us.
Thanks.
Tasneem is the Executive Director of Climate Action Network.
Thanks, Harjeet, and greetings to everybody. And what a perfect segue, Meenal, with your last message, act now and be bold. So let me thank both you and Nick for your contributions to this discussion. The science is extremely important for a network such as ours that have been fighting to address the climate crisis for decades now, actually. So I really do want to appreciate and value the work that you both, together with all the other scientists in the IPCC, has done with this amazing, well, depressing, of course, as you said, but also really critical outputs through the this AR6 report. So thank you very much for the hard work. You are heroes and heroines in our eyes. And of course, we must thank our resident scientist, Stephan, as well. So it's really important, I think, that we recognize that over the years, the messages coming out of this report is not unknown to us, but what makes it different really is that the details are much more clearer. You know, there were still lots of debates, but now things are becoming far more clear for us. And importantly, you know, and I think that the 1.5 special report really was the game changer when the connections between climate change and what we do about climate change and justice became far more visible in these reports. And now where we are at in terms of just that being a central message, equity and justice, you know, that identifies the constraints being injustice, poverty, inequity. These things have become sharper and sharper over time since the 1.5 report. And I remember our excitement when finally scientists started putting in reports the C words, you know, colonialism was even recognized as part of, you know, the legacy of the climate crisis. So we are watching the emergence of the science and how it's starting to connect the dots, and especially with regards to the points that you've made clearly, and that is the need for transformational systems change. All of these are connected. And as a network, we recognize this. And I would like to say, Meenal, when you spoke about, you know, you've done the depression bit and now we're going to do the hope bit, it was really interesting how that connected to the theme that we've adopted for the year. And that is to do two things. We talk about resistance and hope. So we need to disrupt and fight back and, you know, stop the existing destructive systems that's in place, and especially the current energy system. We recognize that, but we also recognize equally that we have to work to ensure that people have hope that a better world is possible. And the work that you've done in this report really shows us how simple interventions that absolutely can address the well-being of many, many marginalized sectors of our societies, those living in poverty and suffering inequality. Those measures contribute to their development and their well-being as well. And I think that that's just been an amazing combination of effort and clarity in the report itself. So our work to disrupt system change is going to be big. And I want to say, Meenal, we are going to be bold and courageous. And so this year, for example, in order to disrupt the existing energy system and the domination of the fossil fuel industry, and we want to say, as I said in the call last night, that we recognize, and you would have seen how obscene the profit making has been by this industry. They are emboldened to continue expanding. And that is also backed up by governments who embolden them to expand further, and especially northern governments. And so what we recognize is that the fossil fuel industry pretty much has declared war on people and planet, and we are determined to fight back. This network, together with many of our allies in civil society, has made 2023 the year that we will fight back against the fossil fuel industry. But at the same time, we're also going to put immense effort to ensure that the solutions are scaled up, and the work that we do and that Stephan leads on renewable energy as the alternatives to this destructive energy system at the moment is going to be really a big push on our side, as well as solutions to many of the other systems, addressing the problems with the existing financial system, ensuring that tax justice is ensured, that we deal with debt justice, that's making especially vulnerable countries reel under the weight of very limited fiscal space to address poverty and inequity. So on multiple fronts, this network is positioned this year to ensure that we disrupt existing systems that's causing multiple crises, not just the climate crisis, but social crises. And at the same time, through our work on a just transition, and here we have the focus on justice. Transitions are going to happen, but whether it's going to be just or not is something that we need to ensure as civil society representing communities on the ground. So certainly this is a very challenging time, but also a very hopeful time, because as you both indicated and Harjeet affirmed, we stand at the crossroads. And it is going to be our collective moral and ethical responsibility to make sure that the path we take is the one that is going to result in a better life for all of our people across the world. So thank you very much, Nick and Meenal. We stand ready to ensure that the science is understood, that we ensure people understand the implications of the work that you've done. And of course, we are forever a very strong supporter, and we engage actively in the IPCC processes. So thank you very much for the work that you've produced and the time that you have spent in doing so as well. Thanks, Harjeet, and thanks, everybody.
Yeah, I'll just say we are a bit over time, but thank you very much, Tasneem, for that very powerful message. And thank you, everybody, especially to Nick and Meenal, for taking our time and all the work that you have done for the whole world. And yeah, thank you very much to the participants. Sorry we could not take many of your questions, but we'll continue to engage. And also my thanks to the CAN Secretariat for organizing this session, and also yesterday, and for all the hard work behind it. And thanks again to all the panelists. Really appreciate, and we'll stay connected, and we'll continue to fight this fight.
Thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye.